Okay. And I've got to figure out a way to get it moved so that I can still see the chat. Let's see. Okay. I'll just put the chat on this side. How about? All right. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for stopping in, and if you're watching the recording, then thanks for watching that as well. Welcome to my talk on the storytelling of sound design. So, if you couldn't tell just from the name of the talk, we're going to be talking about both storytelling and sound design and how they apply to video games, among other things. And if at any point I'm not making sense, just feel free to leave something in the chat to let me know, and I'll try to, I guess, rephrase it so that it's a little bit clearer. So, I want to make sure that going into this we have some expectations set, so we know what we're going to be talking about during the discussion. So my goal here is that everybody's able to learn the why, the what, and the how for both storytelling and sound design, and then how we can use them together so that we can make games that, we find meaningful, that can fulfill us, that can be, fun and interesting for the people who we get to play them. So, all right. So before we really dig into the topics, I think it's important to make sure that, I'm able to convey the reason why you should listen to what I have to say in the first place. So, the first thing, I've been playing video games for close to 30 years, so I've got a little bit of experience from a consumer standpoint. After that, I've known since I was about 16 years old that I wanted to be a voice actor, and from then I've acted, no pun intended, in alignment with that vision for about the next 17 years, so I guess that'll give you kind of a rough estimate of how old I am. And finally, I'm a musician. I was enamored with the trombone ever since I saw Lanky Kong play it in Donkey Kong 64, and I haven't looked back since then. So, moving on. All right, to start off this journey, can anybody tell me what storytelling is? Going to give a little bit longer in case anybody's actually going to try and answer that question. The process of making a plot. All right, so somebody is aware of one of the key storytelling aspects. That's great to see. All right, I'm going to use the definition that storytelling is the recounting of real or imagined events in order to entertain others. And the reason why this is important is because it gives us context as to who we are, the people that we associate with, and who we aspire to be someday. It's also important because it helps us connect with the people who we might have similar or different life experiences to. And it's important because when we're immersed in a story, we can just be in the moment and enjoy it. All right, so what do we need in order to start building a story? Well, really, we need about 3 key elements. We need some sort of a location, a relationship, and a conflict. A location, that can be something as specific as this room in this building, in this town, in this city, in this country. Or it can be kind of vague, things like being in space, or even in just like a dungeon. Characters, playing different video games, you get accustomed to characters like the ones that I've got shown on the screen, people like Mario and Master Chief, Crash Bandicoot, Sonic the Hedgehog. But basically, these are the people that these stories are about. And then, obviously, there has to be some sort of a conflict. Otherwise, why are we looking at these events? So, this gives us, a place for the story to happen, the people who tell it, and some substance to what it is that they're doing. And with all of these elements, we can start building on it. And if we introduce more variables, it gives us, more of a chance to flesh out the story. So right now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the conflict side of things, just because I feel like people are a little bit more familiar with, how locations and sort of the relationship side of the characters fits into a story in general. So we'll actually take a look and see that there really aren't that many different kinds of stories. According to Mr. Gotzi here, there's exactly 36 different kinds of situations that you could run into. Some of them are a little bit more obscure. In fact, some of the less widely known ones, I don't think there are really any modern adaptations to them. But I've got some of the more popular ones shown here. So, for example, we've got two different rivals. We can see Ash and Gary. We've got an immortal versus an immortal scourge in a series like Castlevania, where Dracula's thought to be something that's going to live forever, essentially. A hero searching for lost person or persons. That could be something like Spyro, where he's trying to find all of the other dragons and where they were taken, or the dragon eggs. Tyrant, to be overthrown. Somebody like Bowser, who's ruling with an iron fist. An Avenger pursuing a criminal. Spider-Man, or really any superhero fits that to a T. A leader searching for a key item to defeat their nemesis. We've got Sonic the Hedgehog there trying to collect the Master Emerald, and then he can beat Dr. Robotnik or Dr. Eggman, whatever you're familiar with. And then the last example that I've got shown here, we've got some lovers that have to face a common roadblock. In the case of Doki Doki Literature Club, we've got Just Monica is our issue that people have to kind of overcome. So I'm sure, with even these examples, you guys can think of plenty more, and hopefully, that'll give you some idea of what you can put into your games, or if you're interested in looking up the other situations out of the 36, since this is only 7 of them. I would highly recommend that you take a look into that if you're having a bit of trouble figuring out what kind of a conflict your story could have. And if for some reason 36 is too much for you, then this would be the perfect list for you. Somebody named Christopher Booker made this list, and this is called the 7 Basic Plots. And so we've simplified it down from the 36 down to just 7, and those are overcoming a monster. The example I've got there is Phantasy Star. We've got Dark Falls is basically the common thread in that series, but he keeps coming back as the main antagonist. The Voyage and the Return, the story of Pikmin. We've got Captain Olimar. He gets stuck on a remote planet, and he has to figure out how he's going to make it back home. The Quest, which is basically that story that we had with Sonic the Hedgehog, where we've got the character that has to go and find the thing, and then use that to basically overcome whatever adversary is in the way. So another example of that would be something like Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, where Link has to get the ocarina, and then he has to get the Master Sword, and then finally beat Ganon. Then we have the tragedy, a sad story. I don't know if anybody cares about spoilers for The Last of Us at this point, since it's been out for as long as it has, but basically, again, you just want to think of any sort of story where maybe the ending leaves you with a little bit to be desired, but that's basically the cut and dry of it. A comedy, something that's a little bit more lighthearted than a tragedy. And again, the example that I've got there, South Park, Fractured But Whole. There's so much going on in that, in jokes for people who've actually seen the show, and just ridiculous things going on all around. The Rags to Riches story. I guess the best example that I could think of that people might be familiar with is Animal Crossing, where you show up to a city that you're moving to, and you don't really have much to your name. So then Tom Nook says, well, I'll make you a house if you keep doing these odd jobs, and eventually you've got this really nice house and all of these great friendships, and then basically just kind of a happily ever after kind of thing. And the final one we've got is sort of the rebirth or the redemption arc story. Amnesia: The Dark Descent, basically about a guy who did some things in the past that he's not so proud of, and now he's trying to redeem himself through the actions that he takes during the course of that story. So, again, I'm hoping that with these kinds of examples, you're able to kind of start getting the gears turning, and maybe you can start applying these to your own games if you haven't already gotten a set storyline set up yet. So, and of course, this brings us to how would we actually go about using these different aspects of storytelling in our games so that we can have what somebody might consider an objectively good story. Well, I guess the way that I see it, there's a few different ways we can set ourselves up for success. First, we need a story to be dynamic. There's a reason that we're telling this story, and that has to be due to the fact that this isn't a mundane part of the life of the people in this story. The events need to be some sort of a pivotal moment in at least one of the characters' lives so that we can see how they're able to grow throughout the story. Next, we can connect the events with one another in a way so that there's something tying them to the action our cast's taking to go from point A to point B. The example that I've got there, South Park, Trey Parker and Matt Stone did a really great talk somewhere where they said, if you've got a bad story, it's basically this event happens, and then after that happens, this happens, and then after that, this other thing happens. And really what you want to be able to say is that if you're just writing a basic outline for the story, you can say this happens, but then this other thing happens which causes the resolution or whatever else happens in the story. It's not just this is all the stuff that happens. There is a reason that it's happening, and it's because we can see the dominoes falling, so to speak. And lastly, we can keep things simple by keeping the story to basically 3 main plot points. So the reason for using 3, it's a really satisfying number. I'm sure there were a lot of stories you guys listened to growing up. Some of the ones that I listened to, things like The 3 Little Pigs, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Then later in life, I started going to live theater, and you notice that typically, different stories, they take place in 3 different acts. And then anybody who's familiar with movies, some of the best movies, they have trilogies. So I can keep going, but the idea is that when you have 3 main events, it gives the opportunity for characters to grow and really show how they're able to approach the different obstacles that they run into during the story and eventually find the crucial piece of the puzzle in order to accomplish what it is that they've set out to do. All right. So now that we have a better idea of, what storytelling is and how it applies to, basically entertaining people and providing them with, something to do, how does how does sound design fit into this picture? So for starters, you only have so many senses, and a really good way to keep somebody engaged is to use all of them. Take advantage of all of the senses people have. So you can fill their field of view, with imagery. You can give them something to do with their hands so that they're not just like fidgeting or whatever. And then you can also use sound to help them appreciate this world that you've built for them. Sound is also a great way to get people to have an emotional investment in what they're doing. From example, I can say that I've been moved to tears more from a musical score than if I were to just be looking at, a picture or a video of something all by itself. And so we communicate with our players, and the reason we do that is so they know what's happening, how to interact with the world, how to improve their own skills, and how the story fits into the game. So now that we know why we should consider having a sound design, we should also know what that entails. Think of it like you're building a house. So first off, you want to start with the foundation, and that'll give it some support and some structure. This would be things like the background music or the ambience, because when you give things context, like we talked about earlier, then people know where they are. They can kind of have that level of immersion, so that they say, okay, I understand my surroundings. I understand what this is supposed to be, giving the impression that I'm actually in this world. After we do that, we can look at what kinds of sounds we might hear from the different objects that we have within the environment, and these would function as sort of the walls of the house to build off of that structure that we've started with. Things like doors, walking paths, weapons, food, even the furniture that you might have, if you walk into a building. The reason that you want to have these different things is so that you can let the player explore their surroundings, and then this will also give them the information about what things in this environment are important, what things aren't as important, and then they can kind of get their bearings based off of those things. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have characters that are in the story, and that really just kind of puts the cap on top of the house that we are, using as our metaphor for the game. The reason why we want to have characters is because, when you have the different people in your story, they deserve to have a voice, and that gives them a chance to speak their mind and bring their unique spin to what's going on in the story. So, now that we have some idea of, what sound itself is, and what kind of aspects go into, the story building side of things, we're going to actually take a look at sound itself and figure out what it's made of. So again, we're going to be defining sound so that we have a common idea of what it is that we're talking about. So in this case, sound is when you have a vibration that causes waves, and those waves travel throughout a medium. Usually, in order for something to vibrate, there needs to be some kind of a collision. So when we talk, the air from our lungs, they're vibrating the vocal cords, which gives us a sound, and that sound is either a pitch or a frequency. And really, if you think about it, it's not just a singular pitch. It is a group of pitches or frequencies that all resonate together. And there's different qualities to a sound that you can have besides just pitch. Sounds can be loud or soft, or somewhere in between. They can have a different quality to them, so they can sound like they're raspy or gritty or breathy or tinny or rich. Then, when we talk about sound, again, we're usually not just talking about a singular sound. So we want to have some idea of how it is that they all fit together. Do they sound like, they make a nice sound? Do they not make such a nice sound? Are they kind of fighting against each other? And once we know that, what we can do is, when we're designing for our games, the goal is to know what it is that we want, so that if sounds work together or they don't work together, it's by design rather than by mistake, if that makes any sense. So basically, again, kind of the idea is that we want to know how they kind of have that interplay within the different sounds. And then if we want to take a look at another thing that's key to understanding how sound works, we can take a look at what's called envelopes, and that's kind of in the bottom right section there of the image. We have our initial attack, and this is the length of time that it takes to build up to the maximum volume put out by the sound. After that, we've got the decay, which is how fast or slow it drops from that maximum volume to where the sound is going to be held at. The sustain is how long that held sound actually carries out. And then the last component is the release, which is how fast or how slow the sound dies out after what has been created or was creating the sound stops maintaining it. So now that we know what good storytelling is and what sounds are, we can bring that understanding together, and that helps us build a fuller narrative for our games. So again, kind of the main idea here is that we want to start off with the end in mind. So that means that we have some idea of what kind of a theme or situation is going to be the source of our conflict. And after we have that in place, then we can decide, who's there, who's going to, be a key part of the story, whether that's a minor character, a major character, and whether they're going to be helping to achieve this end goal that we're looking to make, or if they're going to be in opposition to that. We can also get an idea for what kind of items they might run into over the course of this. And then really what we want to do is we want to start making a complete list of all of the different kinds of sounds that might exist in the game and why they're there. After we do that, we need to pick the different times that the sounds are going to be used within the game and figure out how we plan to make those sounds a reality. So this could be using existing sounds from somebody's sound library. The game developer could make them themselves. You could get an employee to do it for you. You could get a contractor to do it for you. Any of those things. And after that's been done, then we can change the sounds to make them more appropriate for what's in the game. And when all of that's done, we'll need to categorize all of the different sound information so that it's easier to find the individual files if we need to. And once those are all in place, you can sort the files, put them into the game, put them into the game engine, and basically start testing it to see if everything's working the way that it's intended to, all of that good stuff. So one thing that people do often run into is finding themselves in a situation where they're stuck. They might not know what it is that they should be looking to do, whether that's adding something, whether that's changing something. So something that I found out about recently is something known as the OODA loop. This is something that people in the U.S. military have been using for I don't know how long. And it's a way for them to gain advantage on their enemies. Now, luckily, we don't have any enemies of our own that we have to worry about overcoming with this process. We can just focus on using it to make our games better. So, with that in mind, what we want to know is that with the story and in the game, we want to know it well enough and use that as sort of our compass, our kind of guiding light or our North Star, as a way of making these decisions. So once we have sort of our game Bible put together, we can observe what we've already got on hand. We can orient to the game Bible and what it says, decide if anything needs changing based off of that information and based off of sort of the list of sounds that we had compiled earlier. And then after that, we make whatever tweaks we want to or need to, and then we just go back through that loop to make sure that we do make progress. And if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you can't fix anything or nothing needs to be fixed or changed anymore, then you probably have a game that's ready to go. Now, here's the actual specifics of making the sounds. Again, I mentioned there are sound libraries that exist that are places that you can go and look for the different kinds of sounds that you would want to put into your game. That's if you have some idea of what would be making those sounds. Now, if you don't, then you have these different things at your disposal. I find that that's kind of weird. The Y for the Foley is down below, so this is Foley. But all right, so we've got 4 different categories for the kinds of sounds that you can, or the type of ways that you can make the sounds. The first one is You can use your own voice, or you can use somebody else's voice to make some kind of a sound. That can be somebody talking in your game. That can actually be some of the creatures too, because some people are really skilled and actually know how to make some of those kinds of animal noises, besides just kind of the common house cat or dog. Some people can make like cricket noises, frog noises, or just be like really creative with what they're doing with their voice to make all sorts of just other creepy, eerie, weird, animalistic kind of noises. If that doesn't suit the purpose of whatever sound it is that you're trying to replicate, you can also use stuff from your house or office, or you could hire what's known as a Foley artist to do that kind of stuff instead. You can see on the image, we've got shoes. That could be somebody walking on a surface. We've got like a door there off to the right that you can open and close. I think that's like a telephone, so you can do stuff with the wire or picking it up off of the receiver, dropping it back on there, slamming it, whatever. Sometimes there's other like whip-like kind of sounds or other kind of impacts. I actually have my favorite Foley texture that I've heard here in my studio, and I don't know if you guys can hear this, but this is a bag of cornstarch, and it's supposed to replicate the sound of walking in snow. So that's an idea of what Foley is. From there, if voice doesn't do it or Foley doesn't do it, maybe you're looking at making your background music and you don't need like somebody to sing the melody. There are 4 different categories of instruments that you could be using. We've got them listed there, going from the left to right. We've got brass, we've got woodwinds, we've got strings, we've got percussion. Those are kind of the 4 basics. And obviously you don't want somebody that is going to be using something maybe as simple as a bow to be like an archery bow for your string instrument, but again, maybe you do, because maybe it's not a musical sound that you want. Maybe it is actually like somebody loosing an arrow, and you want to see what that sounds like. Well, that would be one way to do that. And then our last category, we've got computer generated waveforms, and we can use those to make a variety of sounds. I don't even know half of the different ways that you could work with these kinds of computer generated waves, but I know that is something that there's plenty of people out there who have basically either been studying this or doing this for, again, the better part of their professional career. And those people, I would imagine their skills are invaluable when it comes to figuring out how to utilize those types of sounds in your game. So, this slide, we're going to talk about the different kinds of ways you can modify sounds. There's plenty of different things that you could do to them, but we'll just touch on 3 of the basics. Those being attenuation, equalization, and reverb. So attenuation is this idea of playing around with the strength of a sound so that it seems like it's closer or farther away from the source. The reason why you would want to do that is, to give off the impression of distance. Our ears are really good at picking up those kinds of modifications to sound in order to get a better handle on our environment. So that's something that comes in really helpful, especially in like first-person shooter type games. It's something that people really rely on in order to give them that crucial feedback when it comes to understanding their environment. Next, we've got equalization, and that's basically boosting or reducing the certain frequencies within a sound so that it sounds more like the source that you're trying to make it replicate. So an example of this would be, say you've got some sort of an impact sound from somebody hitting something, and you want it to make it sound like it was a harder hit, something that maybe does a little bit more damage than the original sound file. You would EQ the lower end of those sounds in order to give off that impression. And then there's also reverb. Every sound that you hear It's actually radiating in all directions from the source at once. And because of its environment, some of the sound waves will bounce off of surfaces and then get back to your ear. Usually, when you're in a smaller room, it's going to reach your ear fast enough so that you don't really hear too much of an echo. But if you're in other kinds of, I guess, environments, something like you're in a canyon or just anywhere where, maybe like some sort of a cave or a really big church. That's another good example. If you're in those kinds of environments, you're going to want to have something done to the sound so that it gives off, again, sort of that impression of the space around you. And reverb is a good way of doing that. That way, also, it makes it a little bit easier to code because you're not relying on needing to put the same sound in there and then, put it in a second time, but at a lower volume or whatever. You can just add a reverb effect to it, and that'll accomplish the same goal. So, now that we've gone over storytelling and sound design, I'm sure that you're going to be looking for different places that you can go to utilize these different things that we've touched on in this discussion. For that, I've put together a list of resources here. This is mostly just the basics, but again, this is just the things that I could think of off the top of my head. I'm sure if I were to, do more specific research into any one of these different categories, I could probably flesh out a list of 10 or 20 different resources on just that thing. So if that's something that somebody wants me to do at some point, or if I'm going to have another talk sometime in the future, I can prepare for that by putting together, again, something a little bit more tailored to that specific area of sound design. But just getting back to what we've got here, we've got different hiring websites in order to find the different people that can help with your games. So again, there's sound designers, there's Foley artists, there's voice actors, kind of the general websites that you might want to go to. There's stuff like Indeed. There's also Upwork. And then obviously, within the Discord itself, I'm sure there's tons and tons of really skilled and talented people that you can rely on. And then you can also search on social media websites. I don't know which websites you guys prefer to go to, but I know that Twitter's one, especially for voice actors, that they tend to favor when it comes to looking for open casting calls. Again, because I am a voice actor myself, I'm also familiar with some of the other resources that voice actors go to if they're looking for work. So on the basically free to use sites, you've got things like Casting Call Club, you've got Twitter, and then you've got some of the more what are called pay-to-play sites. So that would be voices.com, Voice123, Bidalgo, VO Planet, Backstage. And then if you are a more developed studio, you've got a little bit more funding and you don't want to, deal with sort of the in-house side of casting, you can either talk directly to casting directors or agencies to see who they would recommend to sort of fit the role of certain characters in your games based off of their description and what kind of a voice they might have. I do also have listed here different sound libraries. We've got things like Pixabay, freesound.org, Epidemic Sound, and 99 Sounds. I think most, if not all of those, have a free option, but they also have things like Creative Commons, where you can use the sound for free if you have in your end credits an attribution stating that this is where I sourced these sounds from. Other ones, they might have licensing requirements, especially with music. If you're going to be looking into licensing, I would recommend reaching out to ASCAP, BMI, or LICT. Those are three resources that I'm familiar with that, if you're looking at having more of a background track, like something that you would have heard on the radio, those would be places to find out, what kind of a license you need and how much that would cost. Then The last resources here, sorry to people that are just listening to the audio version of this, but there are different resources that I've got listed as far as websites go. I shortened the URLs because I knew that they would take up way too much space on a slide in a slideshow. So the examples that I've got listed there, different free synthetic sound applications, and those are the ones that were recommended for people, again, who are looking at making synthetic music or sounds. Also, digital audio workstations, or DAWs, that are recommended for video game audio. There's a link to those. I think there's about 4 of them that were listed on that. And then I have 2 different YouTube playlists. One is for more of the storytelling, if you wanted to take a deeper dive into what some of the free resources are on YouTube that discuss that. And then one that also goes more in depth into some of the different topics regarding sound design. So, if you found this discussion helpful and you want to get in touch with me, I would be happy to help with any of the projects that are going on in the Discord. I love seeing people succeed. I'm also trying to, over the course of my career, help about 10,000 different characters or projects. So, I know that that's kind of a lofty goal, but everybody starts somewhere, and that's kind of my I think purpose when it comes to voice acting. So most places you can find me, I'm at Grant Johnson VO, and I also have my email listed there. It's gjohnson@grantjohnsonvo.com. And of course, if you thought that this was, the biggest waste of your time and you didn't enjoy this at all, my name's actually Greg, and feel free to go ahead and lodge a complaint against Greg with the Discord management. So, all right. Does anybody have any specific questions? Thanks. Thanks everyone for their enjoyment. Sure. Yeah, I'll get that list of resources sent over. Looks like we've got at least one more comment or question coming through. So, okay. Uh, just wait one more second here. Let them finish up their thought. Okay, joined late. Wondering on experience with Fmod and sound in video games, and is it something that I would recommend? Um, I guess I'm not familiar with Fmod, so I wouldn't be able to, I guess, recommend any specifics as to whether or not that would be a good use versus another. If I had some time, I can maybe follow up with you and get you that information. But just offhand, I like I said, I'm not familiar with that as far as sound design and video games go. All right. I do have one bonus. So, is anybody interested in music or music theory? Okay. We do have some interest. So, I've got kind of a lot going on this slide. I'm going to do my best to give very, very basic understanding of what music theory is in sort of about a 5 minute conversation here. But all of the information is on the screen, um, and I guess we'll just kind of start with what I consider the basics and sort of build on that. So first off, music again is basically um, how we communicate with sound in sort of a storytelling aspect, but it's just using sounds to tell the story. So um, what had to happen in order for us to be able to do this in a constructive way is that the sound needed to be organized into groups, um, and those groups we need to be able to tell if they're going to be in consonance with each other or if they're going to be in dissonance with each other. So again, that's kind of does the sound like it's meant to fit, or does it sound like it doesn't? And the way that it ended up happening was somebody took the first 7 letters of the alphabet and then they named the different pitches after them. And then after that, each pitch, the cool thing about music is that if you were to take the pitch and take the value that is half of that frequency or twice that frequency, so like say a pitch is 440 hertz. If you had a pitch that was 220 hertz, or if you had a pitch that was 880 hertz, they're going to sound like they're the same pitch, just higher or lower. And that's what we call octaves. So in music, a note that is an octave above or below shares the same name. So, the lowest note on a piano is A0, and then I think there's 88 keys. So if you look at what comes in an octave, we've got 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we have somewhere around be 8. So maybe like 7.5 octaves on a piano. And the other kind of cool thing is that the reason why it's called an octave is because we've got 8 notes. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for each letter, and then we have the octave, which puts together our 8th one. And then one thing that we did to further classify music into groupings is we have something known as scales. So this is basically we've got these different scale modes here, and they each start on a different letter within an octave, and they each have the same 7 notes with slight modifications. This little B, that's supposed to signify that the letter is flat, and then this pound symbol, that represents a sharp. So when you have the notes inside of an octave, there's also these other 5. They fall in between 2 notes, and they're what's called a half step or a semitone. And if you're looking at the note, if you go from an F and you're going to raise it, it's called an F sharp. And if you're starting at G and you want it to be lower or flatted, then you would call it G flat. And again, the different scales, they all have just those 7 or 8 notes. They don't have these other ones unless you change keys. But the other kind of cool thing is that there is another scale that's not listed here. It's called the enharmonic scale, and that's going to include every single note between octaves. So it's going to go from C all the way up to C, and then it's going to have all of these other notes played in between them. So going back to the different modes, the reason why we have them is because back in 12th century Greece, they wanted to be able to classify what all of these different groupings of notes were, so they gave them names, and each one of those modes or scales starts on a different starting point within that octave. So again, Ionian, that's also known as the major scale. That starts on C and it goes all the way back up to C, and it's just as shown in the image. But then if we have something else, we'll go with, this is actually Aeolian. It's missing an O here. It's if you see over on this side, the O's present, but this is also known as the minor key, or the relative minor to C. So that starts on the A on the piano and then goes to the other A. And the differences are it's got a flat third, a flat sixth, and a flat seventh. And of course, all of these other scales have those different modifications within them. The kind of cool thing that you can do with these different modes or scales is that you can arrange them based off of how happy or sad they sound. And, or actually, I guess the better way of describing it is whether it sounds bright or more dark and gloomy. So basically going in order from the brightest to the darkest, we've got Lydian, Ionian, Mixolydian, Dorian, Aeolian, Phrygian, and Locrian. And I'm trying to think. I want to say that an example would be, I'm pretty sure Lydian, I'm pretty sure that's the mode that they used to write Saria's song from Legend of Zelda. Don't quote me on that, but I'm about 95% certain that that's where that song comes from, is basically just playing the different scale notes in the same order. So it would be with basically just a sharp 4 compared to a major key. So another thing that we want to know about with music is how to build on just the scales. And this is how we do it, is by making what we call triads. So the reason why it's a triad, again, is that there's 3 notes, and we start with the root. And the root is whichever scale degree we're going to start on. So in this example, it's a major triad that starts on C. So the bottom note there is the root, also known as the C. Then we've got 2 scale degrees up from that is this note, which is E. And then the last one we've got is the 5th of the triad, and that in this case is the G. And we have, if we look at the piano, going up from C, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones in between. And in music, we call that interval a major third. And then between the C and the G, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 half steps. And we call that interval a perfect 5th. So that's going to play a lot into what we're looking at going from the major triad to these other ones. So the only difference that we make going from a major triad to a minor triad is we take the major third and it turns into a minor third. So instead of playing E natural, we're playing E flat. Then, if we wanted to change the minor triad into a diminished triad, we would take that perfect 5th and we would drop it to a flat 5th, and that gives us G flat. So we've got C, E flat, G flat in this diminished triad. And then, if we actually go back to the major triad, the only change that we have to make to that to make it this augmented triad is we have a sharp 5th. We have a major third here, C to E natural, and then we have G sharp as the top note there. And the kind of cool thing about an augmented triad is it gives you this really kind of open, spacey kind of feel. And it's kind of nice if you want to go with something that's kind of eclectic or supposed to give you sort of this foreboding sense of like, I don't know what's going on. Same with the diminished. The diminished triad is another one that's really useful if you're going to kind of set up a little bit of suspense, because you can tell that the notes, they're kind of crunchy is kind of the quality that people give that sound. So, and to kind of finish off the discussion on triads, the reason why these are the only options that we have is that if we were to expand the distance in between any of the notes or make them smaller, we would no longer have a root, a third, and a 5th. We would start having like some sort of a 2nd or a 4th or a 6th, or, you know, different intervals than the ones that fall into that in how they've named those different intervals. So that's kind of the reason for sticking to this basic structure for triads. Another kind of cool thing that you can do, and this is getting into more advanced stuff, but you can also add a seventh onto a triad for most triads to make them a little bit more open, have a little bit more character, and you can also use that as a better way of kind of dealing with this next topic that we're going to get into a little bit. So this thing's called the circle of fifths, and the reason why it's called the circle of fifths is that perfect fifth relationship that we had talked about in the triads. You know, these 7 scale degrees, or not scale degrees, but half steps or semitones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There is exactly that many between each of the letters going around the outside of this circle. So from C to G, that's a perfect fifth. From G to D is a perfect fifth. And it's always 7 in between them. And as you're going around this circle, you can start to create different key signatures on the piano. So that would start to incorporate some of these black keys into use if you were to be playing those scales. So going from C to G, we gain 1 sharp. So we gain F sharp is the leading tone that they have. So it's the very last note in the scale before you get back to the octave. So that would be right here, would be where that F sharp goes. And as you continue to go around the circle, you're going to be either adding 1 sharp to the key signature, or once you reach this point where basically you have the same number of sharps or flats, you can basically, you could call it G flat or F sharp for the key. So it's really a horse apiece, but not a lot of people use this key because it's really difficult for musicians to read it, because you have to constantly be thinking, okay, this note is actually, you know, a half step above or below it. So, but then after you reach this point, we switch over to going off of just the flats, and as you continue to go around the circle, you lose 1 flat all the way back until you get back to C. And the kind of interesting or useful thing about understanding how the circle of fifths works is being able to modulate keys. So if you want to modulate to a key that's going to be relatively close in terms of the number of sharps or flats, you just look and say, okay, which one is only 1 away in either direction, and say, okay, I want a song that's going to modulate up or it's going to modulate down. You could look at it that way. Another thing that you can do is these different relationships that we have within a key. So let's say that you want to modulate to the 5th of C. Well, that would be basically just doing the same thing that we talked about here, is going from one key signature to another, which that's another reason why understanding the circle of fifths. Fifths are a really, really useful relationship to understand in music, because it's so easy to go back and forth between the two. And another thing to understand with music is this concept. It's called second dominance or secondary dominance, and that is if you were to have a chord played that you wanted to go in a certain direction, like you wanted to resolve it to, let's say, you know, the 3 chord in this. We'll keep using the key of C as our example. But if you wanted to have some sort of a chord that you want to resolve to this, one of the better ones to do is the 5th of this chord. So, you know, what's the 5th of this? Well, you go up 7 scale degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you'd want a B major chord, likely, if you wanted to resolve to this, and then that would get you back into being in this key, but starting from the chord that would be the E chord in the key of C. So I think there's maybe 2 other things that I want to quick touch on. That would be chord progressions. So a chord progression is basically just a way of notating what we were just talking about with the scale degrees. So you've got a 1 chord, a 2 chord, a 3 chord, a 4 chord, because that's being named off of the scale degree that the chord is associated with. you can also distinguish between whether the chord is major or minor, whether or not the number that you ascribe to that is capitalized or not. So if you've got a minor chord, it would be like a small 1 or a 2. And we're talking about like Roman numerals here because that's the numbers that you would use that can be capitalized. Then we would also have the major ones, they would be capitalized. And then if you also have like diminished and augmented, I want to say diminished has like the degree sign, typically the little tiny circle in the top or in the superscript. Augmented, I don't know what the shorthand for that is, but that's a way of basically notating out which chords you're going to have and then what kind of a sound they're going to have based off of what kind of, again, sort of triad they fit into. And again, the progression tells you how it goes from the beginning of the song to the end of the song. If you were to just show somebody the progression, if they're well acquainted with how music theory works, they would be able to wrap their hand around, okay, this is where this song is going to go. And the other kind of cool thing that you can do with chord progressions is that, at least for me, when I was learning about it, there was this one kind of graph that I saw in my music theory book that told me how you could, or what the best chords to go from one chord to the next would be if you wanted to eventually work your way back to the one chord or the sort of the root of the scale. So most of Western music is comprised of something called the 1-5-6-4 chord progression. The cool thing about that is, again, you can just play those 4 different triads on a piano, and that in my resources that I have for that one YouTube playlist, it's got a song example of all of the different examples in pop culture that, well, not all, but there's a lot of different songs that use that chord progression. And then resolutions. So going from one chord to one or two others, if it's going to be at the end of a phrase in music or if it's going to be at the end of a song, we call that a resolution. And then depending on which chords are involved in that, we have different names for it, and they can have different kinds of feels. So one of the kinds of resolutions, that's going to be a 5-1. That's like a dominant chord to the root. Let me look up 5-1. We'll check what that's actually called. Okay, it's a perfect cadence. So that's a 5-1. Imperfect cadence is another example, which, hold on. Okay, so, okay. Perfect cadence is basically, it would be these triads, the major fifth, and then the major root, like, of the scale. So like a G chord resolving to a C chord, using them in what's called first inversion, which is basically seeing these notes in this order on the score. Imperfect would be if any of these notes were on a different line or space so that they were broken apart. Those are called inversions. And then there's also like plagal cadence, a deceptive cadence, a half cadence. And those are to make it seem like the song hasn't quite wrapped up or finished yet. It's to kind of deceive the listener into thinking that they're going to be done when either they're not, or the song wants to end on sort of this feeling of, again, still having some level of tension, or some unresolved feelings or thoughts or things of that nature. So I think that's about all I have. So if we're done with any other questions that we have, again, I want to thank everybody for stopping by to appreciate the conversation, and hopefully you guys can start to utilize some of these concepts in your own work. So, all right. If everybody's good with that, I'll go ahead and end the recording.